Dear friends of VisualPolitik, I'm sure I don't need to do much to convince you that Latin America is one of the most unsafe and volatile regions in the world. Unfortunately, violence and crime have made some Latin American areas very dangerous. As you may know, we're talking about a region that has been strongly infested with drug trafficking, arms trafficking, and many other illegal activities, which have been executed without the individual states having been able to, let's not fool ourselves, wanting to fix the situation. Even though it may be hard to understand, many criminal groups have built extremely close links with governments and public institutions in the region. In some cases, these groups are even able to influence, control, and direct entire governments. Here on VisualPolitik, we recently talked about the case of Central America. But there's another volatile country which we can't ignore, and it's one which has shot to the lead in recent years and may yet become the most dangerous country on the planet. I am, of course, talking about Nicolas Maduro's Venezuela.
La democracia venezolana es el poder popular y el poder popular debe estar a todo y pendiente.
This is not a new story. We've already talked on this channel about how Venezuela is becoming a narco-dictatorship at breakneck speed. But unfortunately, that's not the worst of it. In today's Venezuela, crime and organized crime are so much a part of the scenery that if crime decreases, it's not outlandish to conclude that there are simply fewer and fewer things to steal. Almost 30,000 fatalities each year in a country that is not at war. 130,000 violent deaths in the last 5 years alone, according to released data, is truly awful. What's strange is that, as you can see on the screen, both the known homicide rates and the number of violent deaths began to actually decrease in 2017. This is strange considering that the country is worse than ever both economically and socially, don't you think? And I know some of you might be thinking, well, it's probably because of all the emigration Venezuela has experienced recently. More than 4 million people have left. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands, millions of young people have emigrated, which has to have an effect on the statistics.
Los que nos ha tocado salir prácticamente exiliados, queremos que vuelva la justicia a Venezuela y la libertad.
Well, yes and no. It's a truly grey area. In this video, we're going to talk about the effects of crime in Venezuela. We're talking about institutionalized crime, which has largely been caused by the government itself. And we're also going to talk about how crime has reached such high levels that it's no longer profitable for common criminals to commit crimes within Venezuela, causing many to seek better opportunities outside.
Evil in power.
First of all, we need to set the scene a little. Let's say we're in a regular country. It's not unusual for the government to fight crime and focus resources on persecuting the bad, right? Well, in Venezuela, it's not like that. Here we find the opposite. The bad guys govern. Take a look at this.
Tarek El-Aissami. United States includes Venezuelan minister in the 10 most wanted lists for international narco traffic. Spanish judge investigates half of Maduro's government for money laundering from oil sales.
Surprised? I bet you aren't, especially if you've been following VisualPolitik for a while. You've probably seen our video on how Venezuela has become a narco state, and in case you haven't, I'm going to link to that in the description. The truth is that there's not much that can surprise us anymore from Venezuela, except for maybe one thing: how the Chavista regime has managed to monopolize street crime.
Maduro calls for ideological-related groups to, quote, defend peace.
Yes, that's right. The Venezuelan government has literally thousands of paid criminals. Criminals who, in many cases, have been armed by the state itself to function as para-political groups for political repression. They're known as collectives. The collectives are groups that mobilize at the government's request, especially when the opposition protests. Then they move around on motorcycles, carrying long weapons and shooting at everything that moves with absolute impunity, while the police and the Bolivarian National Guard watch them impassively. In many cases, they even act together. In other words, that's how Venezuela's violence has been controlled by the state, not for the purpose of ending it, but to dominate and mobilize it against opposing citizens. And no, that's not the end of it. In addition to the deadly collectives, which is now how they're popularly known, the actual state security forces, well, so-called security, act as true criminals. To give you a better idea, according to the data provided by the UN, almost 7,000 people lost their lives due to resistance to authority between January 2018 and May 2019. That is, in just over a year, there were 7,000 extrajudicial executions.
464 policemen are prosecuted in Venezuela for extortion and kidnappings.
Basically, in Venezuela, crime occurs at every level, and that largely explains why it goes unpunished as well. When the police themselves are often complicit, it isn't good news.
92% of homicides in Venezuela go unpunished.
And we're not just saying that on this channel. Even Michelle Bachelet, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, described the situation in her report on Venezuela as such.
My office has continued to document possible extrajudicial execution cases committed by members of the Special Police Forces of the National Police, FAES. Only last July, the non-governmental organization Victim Monitor identified 57 new cases of alleged executions committed by FAES members in Caracas. Michelle Bachelet.
And I don't think you can say, even though Nicolas Maduro often makes such claims, that Bachelet is part of some international movement that is hell-bent on persecuting the Bolivarian regime. Given Bachelet's leftist leanings, it's actually pretty absurd to think that. And considering Venezuela's situation, the testimonies and information documented by the UN seems to be on the conservative side, which isn't all that surprising, by the way. And still, there is more.
Y tengamos que ir a una batalla definitiva por la paz en Venezuela, por la unión nacional. Vamos a prepararnos para derrotarlos.
Along with the collectives and the state security forces' reprehensible actions, the current situation in Venezuela has also multiplied the incidence of small-scale crimes. Not to mention the widespread corruption that reigns throughout the country. Nowadays in Venezuela, to get official documents, passports, or even to get medical attention, bribes are indispensable. And this has two fundamental reasons. On the one hand, we have poverty and practically useless wages. Hyperinflation has made local salaries grossly insufficient.
The new minimum wage in Venezuela is only enough to buy an egg carton.
And therefore, petty crime becomes almost natural. It's just a matter of survival. When in need, people take advantage and try to get any money they can using the lack of control and impunity in their favor. Now, some of you might be saying, but Simon, didn't you say before that crime was decreasing? It doesn't seem to be the case with what you just described, Simon. Well, it may seem like a contradiction, but the truth is that yes, crime is decreasing, and we're going to tell you why. And listen up, because there are some curveballs coming.
Los modelos productivos que hasta ahora hemos ensayado han fracasado y la responsabilidad es nuestra, es mía, es tuya.
Why has crime stopped being profitable?
Basically, it's Venezuela's sad but cruel reality. Things are so bad that the crisis has even affected criminals, or malandros as they're known in Venezuela.
Venezuela murder rate dips, partly due to migration, monitoring group. Crisis in Venezuela reduces robberies and assaults. Criminals no longer can afford bullets.
Yes, think about that for a moment. With 200,000% inflation, which is what the IMF forecasts for this year, what use is it to steal small things if the value of the money you're going to get for them will deteriorate almost overnight? What use is it to break into a bank's safe if the bolivars inside are worthless? Or what good is it to steal cars or motorcycles if you won't be able to get spare parts or afford to put gas in them? And if we add the immigration factor, well, the equation is solved. Yes, it may seem surreal and hard to believe, but the disaster that Nicolas Maduro is leading Venezuela into is causing thousands of criminals to look for new places to commit crimes. The result is that Venezuela is simply exporting its crime.
Maduro boosts the exit of criminals from Venezuela.
It's true. Venezuela is so bad right now that even criminals don't want to stay. And you know who the main victims of this phenomenon are? Well, yeah, it's the citizens of the country is unfortunate to accept the criminals, but also do spare a thought for the other 3 million non-criminal Venezuelans who've emigrated as well. Here on VisualPolitik, we can't avoid discussing the effects that this phenomenon is having on Venezuelan immigrants in the rest of Latin America. Because leaving your country behind, your family, and on top of that, everything you've worked for, is already traumatic enough. What if what comes next is even more so?
Realmente yo no quería salir de aquí del país. Como le digo, yo me considero venezolano. Por todos los años que tengo viviendo aquí, amo Venezuela, pero nos lleva a esta situación.
The difficult condition of being Venezuelan in Latin America.
That's right, for many, being Venezuelan has become a challenge in some Latin American countries. Can you imagine what it's like to have to endure constant racist or xenophobic comments, or suffer abuses from the authorities just because you come from a specific country? Well, all of this stems from Venezuelan criminals leaving for neighboring countries. This is how the lives of many Venezuelan immigrants who do follow the rules, which is the vast majority, are becoming more difficult because of the few. And that causes situations like this.
Red tape and xenophobic attacks against Venezuelans in Latin America.
In Peru, for example, we've recently seen even congressmen such as Esther Saavedra harshly attacking Venezuelans from Congress itself.
1 millón de inmigrantes, entre legales y ilegales, entre trabajadores y bandidos delincuentes, tienen que comer, tienen que dormir, vienen a quitar trabajo a nuestros peruanos, señores. Venezolanos, malos o buenos, tienen que salir del Perú.
Can you imagine running away from a dictatorship, from hunger and violence, and receiving such insults from public representatives? It must be rather hard, wouldn't you think? Fortunately, this way of thinking doesn't represent all Peruvians, not at all, but hate speeches that pinpoint a specific nationality are always pretty worrying. And coming from a country's Congress, well, even more so. And that's not the end of it. Even the Ecuadorian president, Lenin Moreno, fell into the grip of this campaign after a pregnant woman was murdered by a Venezuelan.
Ecuador announces the creation of brigades to, quote, control Venezuelan immigrants.
So what is really behind this hatred of Venezuelans in Latin America? Well, it's got a lot to do with poor migratory culture. Traditionally, most of these countries haven't needed to receive migrants, and suddenly, overnight, there's a Venezuelan exodus through the whole continent. Given that context, it doesn't seem far-fetched that many people perceive this movement with fear of something different, something that comes from the outside, and the consequences that it may have. And this is even happening in Colombia. As Venezuela's neighbor, it's welcomed the most Venezuelans, more than 1.5 million since the Great Venezuelan Crisis exploded between 2014 and 2015. Its proximity and the fact that emigrating from Venezuela to Colombia is cheaper has led many common Venezuelan criminals to setting themselves up in the country. At first, the Colombian government's attitude aimed to help the Venezuelan population by opening its borders, granting temporary permits, and accepting Venezuelans with expired passports. However, this wave of solidarity at an institutional level hasn't always repeated at a street level in everyday life, since Colombia joins Peru, Mexico, Chile, Ecuador, among the other countries with the most extreme cases of xenophobia reported by Venezuelans. And when we talk about xenophobia, we mean things like this.
Venezuelans in Colombia targeted by threatening pamphlets.
Of course, this is by no means the majority, and if Latin American societies have shown us anything, it's a huge solidarity to welcome thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who've been forced to flee their country. Yes, criminals must be prosecuted, but it wouldn't be fair for the innocent to pay for the sins of sinners, would it? What's more, these type of xenophobic outbreaks favor the Venezuelan narco-dictatorship as they reduce the pressure on the regime itself. Anyway, this is the reality of violence in Venezuela, and all these factors explain why this country has become a true nightmare. But now it's your turn. Can violence be fought in a country ruled by people who order criminals to kill? Should Venezuelans abroad face their violent compatriots in order to end xenophobia? And what's even more important, do you think this hateful behavior against them is actually justified? Well, we ask the questions, you provide the answers. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Please do hit that like button if you did. And don't forget to subscribe for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our friends at Reconsider Media. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, this channel is possible because of Patreon and our patrons on that platform. Please consider joining them and supporting us in our mission of providing independent political coverage. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.
Porque los que nos ha tocado salir prácticamente exiliados, queremos que vuelva la justicia a Venezuela y la libertad.